broad terms, we can understand the rise of the secession movement as the collapse of the middle ground. The middle ground had to be destroyed.
The idea of secession, it would appear, would be crazy in, say, the early 1850s.
I think in some sense they lost their faculty of reason.
There's a part of this story that I just find so interesting because we're going all the way back to 1860, but you see the role of the media. My guest today is Paul Starobin. He is a frequent contributor to The Atlantic and The New Republic and was Moscow bureau chief for Business Week. And his writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. He is the author of Madness Rules the Hour, Charleston, 1860, and the Mania for War, from Public Affairs Press. Paul, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Bruce. Great to be here.
Charleston, South Carolina, the subject of your book, was and is a beautiful city, pleasant harbor, palmetto trees, old churches and buildings. But lurking behind this was a nervous, militant city with much racial tension and tension between blue-collar and gentry folk in the city. Perhaps you could describe that.
Charleston, in many ways, was the heart of what we now call the Old South. Slavery in Charleston as an institution, as a way of life, went back hundreds of years, even before the year that we're talking about in the book, 1860. It was there from the beginning with the founding of the colony, the settlement there by the British. And so it really became woven into the fabric of the city's life. And you had a kind of gentry that was dependent commercially and culturally as well on this way of life. And so as Charleston grew, and at one time, it was one of the most prominent cities in America, and even before there was in America, New York, Boston, Charleston. Charleston was a leading port. So in some ways it was also very kind of cosmopolitan. Things began to change somewhat around the turn of the 19th century, the end of the 17th century, let's say, when Charleston began to diminish somewhat in commercial significance compared to places like Baltimore, New York, and Boston. Mm-hmm. It began to see a wave of immigration, white men and women and children coming from places like Germany and Ireland. And they were not able to afford slaves for the most part. They were looking for just blue-collar, manual work, however they could get by. And the gentry wasn't particularly interested in those people either. And so you did have this kind of complex set of tensions between the different communities. You also had layered into this the so-called free blacks. These were black men and women who had won their freedom, who had been given their freedom by their masters, and they were kind of a buffer class in Charleston, and some of them owned slaves themselves. So you had a very kind of complex urban environment and a lot of stresses and strains.
Let me ask you on the question of free blacks in Charleston. You have any kind of rough estimate there? Was it thousands of people?
A couple of thousand. I believe it was about, if we're talking in the year 1860, Charleston was about 40,000 people. Bit over 50% of them were white, a couple of thousand of free blacks, and the rest were slaves.
So it's good percentage of the population there.
Charleston was probably about 60% white and 40% black, including the free blacks. You also had significant numbers of mulatto, of mixed race population in Charleston, and the free blacks, the so-called free blacks, in many ways they really were not. Free blacks were not allowed to have their own dogs or pistols. Sometimes they had privileges like in church and marrying who they wanted, so forth. They could own property. That was important. They were tailors. They could keep money at the bank and so forth. So there were all sorts of privileges that were available to them, not, of course, available to the slaves. But the privileges could easily be, revoked by the gentry, and often were in times of tension, and that's something that happened in 1860 as well.
It seemed like the tension towards blacks in Charleston came more from the blue collar, the laborers, and their leader and the mayors that would kind of curry favor to them than the gentry.
Well, the gentry was more or less satisfied with the state of affairs in Charleston, the status quo, because it had profited from it. And, we're talking about gentry that would, just about as soon put a, pistol to their head as hold a hammer in their hand. I mean, they were not of the blue-collar sort. And very class conscious, so they looked down upon these sort of roughneck, blue collar sorts, the Irish, the uneducated types coming over on the boat. Much as the gentry and the Brahmins in Boston did, more or less around the same time, right? In the 1830s and 40s and 50s, these waves of immigration were coming through. And just as today, I mean, there were a lot of efforts to restrict this immigration. In Charleston, the gentry joined in those efforts. The blue-collar workers felt that the slaves and slaves for hire, I mean, Charleston had this kind of unique system whereby a slave, a master of a slave could essentially rent his, quote-unquote property for odd jobs around town, and frequently did this, and the slaves, sometimes were canny enough to pocket some of the income. All of that was very much resented by these, white, blue-collar workers. I mean, Charleston was beginning to industrialize. There were factories, there were sawmills, all this sort of stuff. So there was a competition for labor there, and as far as the white laborer was concerned, those were his jobs. Why should the slave be able to get any kind of income, at the sort of job, even if it was digging a ditch?
I think that's interesting in your book, because the last thing that probably most people get in a kind of common textbook history and a brush through events very fast would be that the Civil War possibly was started with instigation from the laboring classes. It's always thought of as this is a group of plantation men who decided that they wanted to secede.
Yes, but I think we have to be careful about that because it is complicated. I think that the planter class had it at its very much the heart of its self-interest, slavery and the slave system. I mean, the planters in Charleston really truly believed that they couldn't grow cotton, profitably without slaves. They didn't think they could do it under a sort of a wage system. So they very much nourished, the sort of and distributed and wrote the propaganda about slavery and about the need to protect the slave system that everyone in the white community, digested. So I don't think, we don't want to sort of cut the planters off from that part of the discussion. But I think it worked in the sense that the laborers believed that they were part of a superior master race. And so even though, arguably, secession, the breaking away from the Union was not in their interest, they came to sort of accept it as sort of part of their Southern pride or heritage or, the nationalistic sentiment that was circulating in the South.
Talk about the mayor and the vigilance committees and how militant Charleston was.
So in the timeline here, and I think it's important to see this, the South and Charleston would go through sort of waves or spasms of concerns about slave insurrections. In Charleston, this was particularly true. They had a major slave rebellion, or at least the threat of a rebellion, back in 1822 when a free black Denmark Vesey threatened a revolt. If we go to the end of 1859, October 1859, we have John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which was intended to ignite the Civil War. It sent a wave of fear through the South, including in Charleston, and these so-called vigilance committees cropped up in the city of Charleston and in planter communities around Charleston. Basically, they were charged for looking at, the enemy within. It almost conjures up the Salem search for witches, the serpents among us, which is language that I'm taking from their charters. These are essentially, citizen groups apart from official law enforcement, on the search, on the prowl for anyone who might be suspicious, an abolitionist, anyone seeking to kind of, get that John Brown kind of message circulating in the veins of the body politic. banning literature. It was nearly impossible to get a copy of the New York Tribune, Horace Greeley's abolitionist paper in Charleston. Books. Many of the slaves and, of course, the free blacks could read. They didn't want literature in their hands.
You talk about how they would look at people like workers that might come from the North, teachers, nurses that would come from the North, and even soldiers. A soldier has trouble booking a hotel room at night. A woman who is from the North but kept quiet about her views for the most part is hauled in front of the mayor and then locked up in prison. Yes,
the seamstress, Katherine Botsford. I mean, that was a very interesting story, and I think telling, because Charleston, of course, would not be welcoming to abolitionists, but before these stresses and strains, really intensified in 1860, the likely scenario is that if somebody like that is found to be in the city, they would just be put on a train and sent out of town. In the case of this seamstress, who openly confessed to having abolitionist sentiments, she was put in the jail in Charleston. She was given an amount of bail that was impossible for her to meet. There was very little sympathy. She met with the mayor. He encouraged her to write to the mayor of New York to see what he might advise her. Well, the mayor of New York actually was a Southern sympathizer, so he had basically, New York this is a digression, got a lot of money from the cotton trade, and basically there was an important element in New York City that essentially supported the South, or at least, the cotton South and slavery and so forth. So she got no sympathy. Eventually they let her out of jail because, there was nothing else to be done with her. So there was a meanness of spirit that developed in Charleston as the year went on.
The idea of secession, it would appear, would be crazy in, say, the early 1850s, and there was, you describe in your book, a failure of the moderates who really did have control of South Carolina for the most part, the Orrs, Memminger, if I have that right, and the failure of them to pursue a moderate solution and get any help from national players or other states with that seems to have been one of the things that led to the secession movement's rise.
Yeah, I think in broad terms we can understand the rise of the secession movement as the collapse of the middle ground, as is so often the case in politics. In Charleston, you had some very canny, opportunists on the radical side, the secession now side, we can say, who understood, sort of like Bolsheviks of a different era, that the middle ground had to be destroyed. I mean, literally, destroyed. There could be no middle ground because that, we needed to polarize the situation. But there was a very prominent moderate in Charleston who I talked about at length in the book, Christopher Memminger, fascinating figure, an orphan, off the boat from Germany, tremendously precocious. His mentors could see that right away. Most of the orphans in the house in Charleston went on to the trades and so forth. Not Christopher Memminger. At a very young age, just in his early teens, he was shipped off to college in South Carolina, University of South Carolina in Columbia, and so he kind of rose as part of the Charleston elite, became a lawyer, and essentially moderate in temperament, member of the legislature. His great fear was that Charleston and South Carolina would go it alone, would secede from the South, leave the Union, but not in concert with other Southern states, and thereby expose itself to great risk. And it was a very reasonable fear, as I think almost anyone could acknowledge. But his effort to seek that moderate ground, in particular a trip he made to Richmond, Virginia in the beginning of 1860 in January with his daughter, an effort there to say to Virginia, which was kind of holding out on secession, look, let's have a conference, let's get together, let's talk about our alternatives, let's see what we can do. Well, Virginia was not really at that point, even when they wanted to meet with the other southern states to have that discussion. So the moderates, men like Memminger, there was nowhere else to go, really. I mean, it was a failure. He went back to Charleston, and the rest of the year increasingly became season for the radicals.
I love that division that you make, and I think it's important for people to understand how the Civil War progressed and how the secession movement progressed, that really a lot of the debate wasn't just between Union and secession. It was also between secession, South Carolina alone, and secession with cooperation with other southern states. And it gives a picture of different ways that the Civil War could have turned out. It didn't have to just be the way that it did. If perhaps there was cooperation and a nicer secession movement, if you will. And it's also interesting, Meminger's play for Virginia, just you have this interesting political dynamic. Virginia was too moderate to jump to a secession convention, therefore alienating this moderate from South Carolina who then couldn't calm down his radicals.
Right.
And then you end up with war.
Yeah, I mean, it really ended up playing out much as the radicals wanted, which I don't think, we can attribute some of that to calculation on their part, but we can also say it was just, from their standpoint, good luck. But just to emphasize that modern element, I mean, we're talking about Jefferson Davis, a senator from Mississippi, right? I mean, he was the radicals
Yep.
from Charleston wrote to him, as the year progressed in 1860, said, well, what about Mississippi? You're ready to go, right? And Jefferson Davis wrote back, and this is the future president of the Confederacy, right? Nope, actually, we're not quite ready. We're worried about ports here on the Mississippi, all kinds of practical concerns should war come. So, maybe Georgia, Alabama, but there wasn't a whole lot of support for immediate secession anywhere except in South Carolina. And so they ended up, of course, going alone, by themselves in December of 1860. They took an enormous risk. I mean, they didn't know. They couldn't have known that, whether others would follow.
That's right. A lot of people think of the Civil War as the war between the states, and their sense of the history is that, this group of states combined, but really it was South Carolina leading the charge. A reminder that I'm speaking with Paul Starobin, who is the author of Madness Rules the Hour, Charleston 1860, and the Mania for War from Public Affairs Press. I recommend it if you want a good sense of how the Civil War started in this crucial city of Charleston. Because my podcast, My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, is about relating history to the politics of today. There's a part of this story that I just find so interesting because we're going all the way back to 1860, but you see the role of the media, and particularly one media, the Charleston Mercury, and owned by the Rhett family. This media power seems to have stirred up the madness. Could you describe a bit about the Mercury, and then also perhaps address a question that I have reading the book is was it the media that really stirred this population up, as is we see so much of that today, various media forms kind of getting people agitated about politics where they might not have been, or were they already in that state in Charleston? Right.
Well, I think it's an interactive dynamic, as it often is. I mean, the media, in this case the Charleston Mercury, we're talking about a daily newspaper, and remember, this is the era of print, right? We're not talking about the internet or even radio or television or any of those things. This is the way people are getting their information. It's newspapers, it's pamphlets, it's magazines, and most of all newspapers. And not everyone could read. So we had a fairly, there's a literate population in Charleston fed by the Mercury, and there was another paper as well. And the Charleston Mercury circulated outward. I mean, it circulated as far as London. It was in New Orleans. It was in hotel lobbies in New York. Abraham Lincoln, his law office, Lincoln and Herndon, they had a subscription in Springfield, Illinois. The Mercury in 1860 was the vessel of the Rhett family, as you say, and that's Barnwell Rhett Sr. and his son Barney. Barney was Rhett Jr. Barney had not really proved himself yet. Rhett Sr. was an older statesman-like type, been through the Senate, the House, deeply radical in sentiment, viscerally so. Southern nationalist. Barney, in many ways, took after him, and the Mercury was their vessel for implanting on a daily basis that kind of message. Harper's Ferry, right, October 1859, the lesson of the episode, the Mercury says, is the South needs, to stand on its own. We need to be independent. We need to, get rid of the North. It wasn't a message that everybody in Charleston was always paying attention to. I think that the crucial aspect of the media here is that events can seem to confirm these sorts of attitudes and opinions. I mean, Harper's Ferry was a real event. I mean, John Brown really did want to ignite the Civil War. That was grist for the Mercury. At the same time, the Mercury, Charleston, they were being baited by media in the North, like Horace Greeley's Tribune. They were being mocked, for all talk, no action on secession. So the Mercury made, great grist out of that. I mean, the genius of the Mercury, and I suppose of any propaganda, is it can sort of take, it's not all fake news. It can take these little bits, these facts and so forth, and weave them into a compelling narrative. It's really about the narrative, right? I mean, people, we have stories that we need to believe. We need them to understand, to make sense of what is happening around us, especially when there's confusion, there's chaos, it's not really clear what is happening. Well, the Mercury thinks it knows exactly what is happening and what needs to be done. So when you get a political environment like that, it can very much favor these kinds of radical voices that advance, what might be seen as a fairly simple-minded, agenda, but it finds its adherents.
That's a really interesting point, with today's cable networks and social media, and that idea of like a little nugget of truth, something like in their case it might have been, watch out for your tutor. They could be a secret abolitionist, or there's going to be a slave revolt tomorrow, or what happened to John Brown. And I think it is important to see from their point of view what John Brown's raid, just an attack on an arsenal that really was an attempt to start a larger revolt, which would have had a lot of farms on fire and people dead in Virginia, and what the impact of that was on the Southern psyche. So that I get when you say that it's partly the Mercury playing on the fears, and then partially the fears there.
Yeah, the fears are there because, John Brown had a history. I mean, there was, bloody Kansas, the war there, the sort of mini war, a set of skirmishes, which were bloody, fought over whether, Kansas would be a slave state or not. I mean, there was a lot of history there. So the Southerners were not wrong to fear the abolitionists. Not wrong at all. I mean, the question, was sort of how to address the abolition movement, and the Mercury believed that compromise was simply not possible. And so the message to the citizens of Charleston and everyone else was, go to the barricades. We need to defend our rights at all costs, come what may.
If you find that you can't wait for the next episode of My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, don't wait. Subscribe to the premium podcast. It can be as little as $2 a month. And what you're going to get is previous episodes that we've aired over the 11-year history of this podcast. Plus, you'll get bonus episodes. In the last cast about emoluments, we talked a bit about George Washington, Mount Vernon, his farm, his operations. Well, in the bonus episode on the premium podcast, we get into the importance of the Potomac River to the new nation and what Washington was thinking in locating the capital there. www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpoliticspremium.com. We also look at 1789, yes, President Washington's first year, and how that went. Subscribe now can be as little as $2 a month, more if you want to support the program more and get more features. www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpoliticspremium.com.
Let's talk about the Democratic National Convention of 1860, the Democrats, in their wisdom, or what they thought perhaps in their convention in Cincinnati, decide, hey, the next convention is going to be in Charleston because we're really going to impress those Southerners that we're a great national party. And they have the convention right in 1860 in Charleston in the heat of the secession talk and all of the turmoil. And I think the story that's traditionally told is very common. Stephen Douglas, Northern Democrat, goes down there and wants his coronation and doesn't get it, and the delegates leave and it's all broken up. And it always is told in history that it's kind of a spontaneous event like that. Your book perhaps suggests a different tale, that there were definitely some people in Charleston who very much wanted the Democratic Party broken up as a national party and for that convention not to succeed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think we can see that in the sort of the letters that were written at the time. I mean, the radicals in Charleston, let's talk about Rhett Jr., the editor of the Mercury, the son of Rhett Sr., very much had it in his mind that this convention was an opportunity to break up the party and therefore ensure the victory of a Republican, by definition, anti-slavery president, and, bring on the confrontation that he desired. So he, as early as January of 1860, he was fanning this idea of how he was writing to his the Charleston congressman, William Porter's Miles. Here we have it, January 29th, 1860, that, we need to pursue this strategy of using the Charleston Convention as an opportunity to resist, to deal a blow to the so-called national Democrats. Those would be the Douglas Democrats and men like Orr, you mentioned, in South Carolina. Bringing the so-called states' rights men, as they were called, in control, and essentially giving them their marching orders that they were to resist at all costs, a party plank which Douglas was advancing, basically to allow for some form of his, popular sovereignty in the territories, places like Kansas and Nebraska. That was the great issue. So the Southern radicals were determined to resist any movement of a party platform in the direction of possibly allowing for slavery to be banned in the territories. They said that was simply unacceptable. That was the line that they drew. And so essentially when the convention went in that direction and the Douglas men refused to buckle on that point, not wanting to lose the Northern vote, the convention broke up. So there was that spontaneous element. I mean, it was that kind of situation, the hot situation in Charleston, where, the delegates were angered, the Southern delegates, by the refusal of the Douglas men to move. But it had been very much anticipated by people like Rhett Jr. and certainly leaders of the revolt, people like Yancey of Alabama, were on board this strategy as well. So, yeah, it was sort of like, the worse it gets for the party in the eyes of the radicals, the better it gets for us. There was a lot of calculation that was attached to that in Charleston.
The Civil War becomes so important for it always is important in the American mind. It happened in the 1860s, but we still talk about it today. I was riding with an Uber driver the other day who he told me his father, he was from Alabama, and his father just didn't like the North because of the Civil War. And I was thinking, well, I know your age. Your father certainly didn't fight in it. My family came from there, a bunch of Swedes that came in the 1880s, had nothing to do with it, and yet it's always on our brains, and it's hard to get away from it. You do see with the internet a kind of some neo-Confederate debates. Yes. That go on. Some of them, I think, because of the libertarian point of view that the internet has helped give a voice to more of, and you do have some people that say, maybe we should have just let them be. They were a state trying to assert their own prerogatives, and it's not the point of your book to address it directly. You could take almost either side with some of the research that you provide. For one thing that struck me was the amount of venom that was in Charleston, and where perhaps the way the North was viewing the South, that it would be a quick and easy war, could have been tested with better research down there.
Yeah, I think at some point they just didn't want to listen. I mean, there were a lot of efforts by people generally sympathetic to the South, if not, supportive, but at least sympathetic in places like England and places like New York. I mean, there were plenty of Southerners who had business, finance or business in New York and knew the situation and could take kind of a broader perspective. I mean, one of them, he wrote a letter to the radical secessionists in Charleston saying, look, do you really think this is going to work? I mean, maybe, I should come down there with a delegation of, financial types from New York. We can talk about this. It reached a stage, Bruce, where I think the Charleston radicals had just felt like they had heard enough and weren't going to hear anymore. I think in some sense they lost their faculty of reason, which is what one of the few, at least publicly declared unionists in Charleston, James Lewis Pettigrew, felt at the time. I mean, he would write that to his friends in the North, that essentially people have gone crazy, bonkers, Nobody talked at the time in, sort of psychotherapeutic terms as we talk now, but it was essentially a loss of reason that becomes, madness. It was called the contagion. It was like a condition or a disease of the mind. And so when you're in that kind of a state, you're not listening anymore.
They thought they could get a better deal on their own. They thought they'd get a better deal on the world stage. England, France is with us. Yeah. All of this gave them the cotton is king. Even if we don't, I think you mentioned in the book, even if we don't have the banks from the North, we got cotton, and that's as good as currency. One of the debates that's still present, there's a debate whether the Civil War was about slavery, really. Keep hearing it brought up, and I think because it turns some issues that are in today's debates, like states' rights or the power of the federal government. There is some fodder in for many sides of this question, because some comments from the Charleston radicals about bank failures in the North causing all the problems, the economic crisis of 1857 and 58, tariffs and free trade and issues like that. But it also always seems in these debates when someone's saying the Civil War is not about slavery, that it seems to always come back to slavery. What's your thought about that?
Absolutely, slavery. And, listen to this. Quote, "The issue before the country is the extinction of slavery." That's the front page of the Charleston Mercury on Saturday, November the 3rd, 1860, the final weekend before the vote, which Lincoln ended up getting elected. There was no doubt about that. Slavery. All of the propaganda that came from planners. I profile one of the Charleston planners, John Townsend, who wrote this pamphlet that was about as best-selling as Common Sense was, Tom Paine's pamphlet for the American Revolution. All about, slavery, the white man, cotton, system cannot survive without slavery. So, yes, I think states' rights is a serious issue. It was, Calhoun in South Carolina was very much about states' rights. He had died by then. But slavery was the way of life, and the entire society of the South was sort of operated around that pole. I think people were very aware at the time that what they were defending was slavery and their right to have slaves. So you could couch it in that term, property, the right of property. It's in the Constitution. Well, it was in the Constitution. There was a fugitive slave clause, and it was being violated. So that was a constitutional grievance, but it still came down to slavery.
And you'll hear the point that so few of Southern families owned slaves. I read into the book that when you look at the city of Charleston, and a major Southern city it is, that there's so many connections to slavery even by people who don't own slaves.
Absolutely. And the wish to own slaves, one of the promises that was made was in this glorious new Southern Republic, we can bring back the African slave trade, which would mean more slaves, increasing the supply of slaves brings down their price, right? Basic supply and demand economics. Many planners actually were opposed to that because they already had their money invested in their slaves and didn't want to see their property depreciate in value. But for the white collar, the blue collar guy, maybe he can afford a slave or two. Well, let's make the price of a black slave cheaper. So yeah, there was the propagandists were able to appeal to that. And again, as we talked about before, it was important for the blue collar man to feel that he was part of the superior race. That was part of the message. And so that too depended on slavery.
I found a bit amusing in the book, going back to the point about media and its impact on politics, that the Charleston market was all set to go after the presidential nominee. They thought it would be Seward, and then here comes Lincoln.
Yeah, Seward was everybody's. They shouldn't be picked on there because everyone thought it was going to be Seward. The political cognoscenti, right? He was the former governor of New York, state senator Seward. He was a giant in the movement. He was extremely well connected in Republican politics. It all seemed to be lined up for him, but people got a little bit nervous. They went to the convention in Chicago, Republican convention in May. Suddenly they worried, well, maybe Seward isn't our guy. He might alienate, votes as, the situation's getting more polarized. We need somebody who's a little bit more moderate. And so somehow, Lincoln, really not that well known in national politics at that time, becomes the nominee. Really one of the great surprises and fateful surprises, of course, in history that it turned out to be Lincoln. He was the compromise choice, right? He thought that the slave South could be left alone and eventually slavery would perish. That was not Seward's position. Seward believed in the irrepressible conflict, as it was called. And the Mercury, of course, embraced that idea because they also viewed it as an irrepressible conflict. Lincoln did not. I think genuinely he did not. He thought slavery should be banned in the territories and the South could be left alone and eventually the institution would perish. That was his position, basically.
And they have to find pictures of him because they don't have them, and then attack his image and turn him into kind of this abolitionist that he was not.
Yes. Unbelievable job there, really. One of the, in terms of how propaganda can work, they essentially reinvented Abraham Lincoln. It was fortunate at the time, that men and women didn't travel the way they did earlier. So Lincoln was not known in the South, and they didn't really campaign either. So he didn't campaign in the South. So they had no way of knowing in Charleston or anywhere in the South really who Lincoln was. So he could be essentially fashioned as a kind of a demon by the Mercury. They said that Lincoln, he was a coward, which was of course not true. They said that he was an abolitionist. Well, the truth is the abolitionists distrusted Lincoln. They distrusted him when he was a member of Congress. In fact, some of them called him, I think it was sort of he had a legal case where he earned a fee for helping get a fugitive slave returned. They called him a slave hound. The abolitionist. So, Lincoln was a complex figure, as I think we know, but he was reduced, to a caricature in the pages of the Mercury, and it worked. People needed to believe in a foil, which I think is a parallel to today's environment as well. They really needed a foil, and Lincoln, as sort of false Lincoln, provided that foil.
And I think it's interesting because there's a couple of things there in that story about the Mercury and Lincoln. You have the attempt by the Republican Party to sort of moderate by choosing Lincoln over Seward. Really utterly fails, and you kind of see that no matter who they sent down the pike, the Republicans were going to get this treatment from the press, at least in the Deep South. Sure. And their attempts to moderate didn't work. I like that you paint the differences between all the sides on this issue of slavery. Absolute abolition, absolute no government interference with slavery anywhere of any kind, those two positions. But also this kind of future aspiration for those who didn't have slaves or only had a few, that could see that in New Mexico or in Nebraska or Kansas that they would have a future for themselves that they might not have in Carolina. And then on the other hand, Abraham Lincoln's view, and I had just talked with Sidney Blumenthal about his book on Lincoln, where he was talking about how Lincoln goes to Kentucky and sees this practice that he hadn't seen as much of in Illinois and just is horrified, and his attempt to kind of extinguish it by limiting the growth, not by, as you indicate, not by banning it where it exists now. In fact, he might have supported an amendment that would allow it to forbid any ban in the Deep South.
I think he was interested in trying to find a way to mollify, if not appease the South, which, as I think you're saying, may have been a fruitless mission on Lincoln's part, but one that I think he believed in. And look, I mean, the shooting phase of the war started when he refused to evacuate Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, and the Confederates bombarded the fort. I mean, he very much wanted the first shot to be fired by the South. I think that's sort of consistent with his dispositions. Seward may not have been so charitable in that sense, right? He might have been more of an incendiary.
And there was the potential, I suppose. I think the fear in Charleston was, wow, now the Federals have a fort pointed at us in the harbor. And you actually point out in your book how Anderson, the major there, evacuated. It was his decision to evacuate the fort. Well,
yes, the Federals occupied, it was really just a skeleton crew, there was about 70 of them, a fort on Sullivan's Island, not in the middle of the island proper, as Sumter was, called Fort Moultrie. And Moultrie was really basically surrounded in 1860 by, hostile forces, citizens who would come out and essentially bait the soldiers within. And there was a real fear, I think a very reasonable fear by Anderson, that Fort Moultrie would be attacked and there would be bloodshed right there. And his appeals to Washington, I mean, James Buchanan was the president at that time. He really wasn't, I guess he was paying attention, but he wasn't doing a whole lot about it. So the situation was really in Anderson's hands. So basically, he decided, on his own, that under cover of darkness, even though it was a moonlit night, he would move his men, I guess it was a mile or two from the position at Fort Moultrie, across the harbor, the middle of the harbor, to Sumter, which was not really some terrific fortress, but at least was in the middle of the harbor and was relatively impregnable, at least compared to Moultrie. So that happens right towards the end of the year, around Christmas time, 1860, enrages the population of Charleston. They think that somehow Anderson is, setting up to, turn his guns on the city, which is really far from the truth. They thought he should have sought permission, from the city or South Carolina to do this. I don't know why. So then, it became this sentiment, are we going to try to starve the guy out, with his soldiers? And, some of the Charleston gentry thought that was a little bit unchristian. But nevertheless, that was really the situation that Lincoln found when Lincoln took office. Remember, the inauguration at that point was in March. Third week of March, so Lincoln is taking office at that time and has very little time to really make up his mind about what he's going to do about this deteriorating situation at Sumter. He inherited this mess, essentially.
By the time he gets to office, the madness had already ruled, in a sense.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The madness was well underway by the time Abraham Lincoln took office. That was the situation. What do I do about about Charleston? And as we said earlier, Lincoln was a reader of the Charleston Mercury. Lincoln loved to read newspapers, so he knew this. He knew what the state of public opinion was in Charleston. And in fact, he had a secret, messenger at that fort, Abner Doubleday. Remember him? He's the guy. The legend has it he invented baseball. He was an officer at Fort Moultrie, and Abner, he was from upstate New York. He was no friend of slavery or of the slave South. He was sending coded messages through his brother, Abner's brother, at a bank in New York to Lincoln and Springfield, including maps. So Abraham Lincoln was well informed of the situation in Charleston.
One of many interesting insights from the book, Madness Rules the Hour by Paul Starobin, Charleston, 1860, and The Mania for War. Paul was my guest today. Paul, thanks very much for appearing on the podcast.
Thank you, Bruce. I enjoyed it. And I love what you're doing with history and how it rubs up against our political present.
Thank you.
I think we need more texture in our political conversation, not less.
I want to thank Paul Starobin. We'll have a link to his book, Madness Rules the Hour, on the website at www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics.com. Bye for now. Now, if you're a subscriber to the Premium Podcast, it's not goodbye. You'll hear much more. We're going to talk a little bit more about this topic and others on that Premium Podcast. Remember to sign up. www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics.com. There's a link there. Thanks for listening.